Jake had always been proud of his backyard. It was the perfect spot to unwind after a long day. The centerpiece of his little paradise was the sparkling pool, glistening under the sun, a true oasis in the middle of his suburban neighborhood. When he first bought the house, the pool was exactly what he had imagined. He would spend weekends lounging by it, reading books, or just relaxing with a cold drink in hand. It was his personal retreat, a place where he could escape the hustle and bustle of daily life. But over time, something started to change. It all began innocently enough. His neighbors, a friendly family next door, had a pool of their own, but for some reason, they rarely used it. Instead, they started spending more and more time at Jake's pool. At first, Jake didn't mind. He was always the type of person to be generous, and he didn't mind the occasional visitor. The neighbors, after all, were friendly, and the kids loved swimming. What could go wrong? However, as the weeks passed, things started to get a bit out of hand. The first few times they came over, it was just a few of them, mostly the kids and maybe one or two adults. Jake didn't mind too much. It felt nice to have the laughter and energy of a family enjoying his pool. But soon, it wasn't just an occasional visit. It became a regular occurrence. His neighbors started showing up almost every weekend, sometimes without even asking. Jake would be in the middle of relaxing, enjoying the peace and quiet, only to see them walking through the gate, towels and snacks in hand, ready to swim. The worst part was that they started treating his pool like it was their own. They'd leave things behind, beach balls, toys, and even snacks that would often get forgotten and left to spoil. Jake had become a silent observer of it all, feeling like his privacy was slowly being chipped away. His sanctuary, the one place he thought was just for him, was becoming more and more public. He started to feel as though the pool wasn't really his anymore. It was as if the boundary between his property and theirs had been erased. Jake tried to be polite about it at first. He didn't want to cause a scene. But the more it happened, the more frustrated he became. He had worked hard to have this beautiful backyard, and now it seemed like he was constantly sharing it with people who didn't even ask for permission. His neighbor's casual disregard for his space left him feeling uneasy. He had never been the type of person to make a fuss, but the situation was becoming too much to ignore. He couldn't just sit back and let it continue. One Saturday afternoon, as Jake sat by the pool, he watched as the neighbors arrived once again, this time with a few extra friends. His mind began to race. This was it. He could no longer sit idly by and let this continue. His peaceful, private retreat had become a public space without his consent, and it was time for a change. The frustration he'd been holding back was bubbling to the surface, and Jake knew something needed to be done. But what? How could he stop his neighbors from using his pool without creating tension or making things worse? The thought of confrontation made him uneasy, but the situation had reached a breaking point. Something had to change, and fast. Jake's frustration had been building up for weeks, and now, as his neighbors approached the pool again, he knew he couldn't let it slide any longer. He had tried to ignore the growing annoyance, but the constant interruptions to his peace were taking a toll. The moment the neighbors, Mark, his wife Rachel, and their 3 kids, walked through the gate, towels in hand, Jake knew it was time to act. He sat there, still as a statue, watching as they unloaded their bags, setting up their snacks and pool toys as if they had every right to be there. The laughter and chatter filled the air, and while it wasn't unpleasant, it reminded him of just how much his space had been invaded. Jake had never been the type to shy away from confrontation, but this was different. These were his neighbors, people he saw every day. The last thing he wanted was to create tension between them, but he couldn't let them continue using his pool without asking. The kids ran and jumped into the pool with splashes and giggles, completely unaware of the undercurrent of frustration that simmered in Jake's mind. He watched them for a moment before standing up, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about his boundaries, his privacy. It was about the respect he felt he deserved for the space he worked so hard to create. Walking over to the edge of the pool, he cleared his throat, catching the attention of Mark and Rachel. The kids continued to play, oblivious to the tension that was about to unfold. "Hey, Mark, Rachel," Jake started, trying to keep his voice calm. "I need to talk to you about something." Mark, always easygoing, looked up from where he was sitting at the poolside. "Hey, Jake. What's up?" He grinned, clearly not realizing anything was wrong. Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start. He didn't want to sound harsh, but the words he needed to say felt like they were stuck in his throat. Finally, he just blurted it out. "I've been meaning to ask, could you please stop using the pool without asking first? I really value my privacy, and it's been getting a little overwhelming." Rachel paused for a second, her smile fading slightly. Mark, too, seemed taken aback. They hadn't realized how their casual visits had been affecting Jake. There was an awkward silence before Mark spoke up, his tone light, but laced with a hint of defensiveness. "Oh, come on, Jake, we've been neighbors for years. It's just a little pool time. We didn't think it'd be a big deal." Jake's heart sank. This wasn't how he had hoped the conversation would go. "I get it," he said, trying to stay patient. "But it's been happening a lot, and I just feel like I'm constantly sharing something that's meant to be mine. I'm not saying you can't ever use it, but I'd appreciate it if you could ask first." Mark looked at Rachel, and they exchanged a glance. Jake could see they were both processing what he was saying, but there was a bit of a reluctance in the air. It wasn't that they were malicious. They just didn't realize how much their actions were affecting him. Finally, Rachel spoke up. "We didn't mean to overstep. We'll try to be more mindful, Jake. We're sorry if we made you feel uncomfortable." Jake nodded, relieved that they weren't angry with him, but he could tell that his words hadn't fully landed yet. The situation wasn't fully resolved, but it was a start. As the conversation ended and the neighbors returned to their swimming, Jake sat down again, his mind still spinning. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he had to address the issue, but for now, it was a small victory. The seed of change had been planted, and Jake hoped it would grow into something that restored his sense of space and peace. The conversation with Mark and Rachel had gone better than Jake had expected, but deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. While they had apologized and promised to be more considerate, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't fully understand how much their behavior had been bothering him. He had asked them politely, but part of him knew that if he didn't do something more, the same pattern would continue. It was clear that a casual request wouldn't change things for good. The next few days were quiet. The sun hung high in the sky, and Jake spent his time working on various projects around the house. Still, the issue with the pool lingered in the back of his mind. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about his sense of control over his own space, the boundaries that needed to be respected. Jake wasn't the type to back down easily, but he had a tendency to avoid conflict, and that's why he had been hesitant to speak up earlier. Now he knew he couldn't just let it slide. As the weekend approached, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. He was sure his neighbors would show up again. This time, though, he would be ready. He decided that instead of waiting for them to take the first step, he would confront the issue head-on. He needed to make sure they understood how important this was to him, and he wasn't going to let fear of making things awkward hold him back. Saturday morning arrived, and sure enough, the sounds of children laughing drifted into his yard. Jake took a deep breath, his mind made up. He walked to the back door, opened it, and stepped into the sunlit backyard. The kids were already running around, splashing in the pool, while Mark and Rachel lounged nearby, chatting and sipping iced drinks. Jake's stomach twisted a little as he approached them, but he pushed the nervousness aside. This time, he was going to make it clear. "Hey, Mark, Rachel," Jake called out, his voice steady but firm. They both turned, and for a moment, there was an awkward silence. The kids continued playing, unaware of the tension between the adults. "Jake," Mark said, a smile on his face. "What's going on?" "I need to talk to you both," Jake said, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to sound harsh, but he knew it was time to be direct. "I really need to ask again. Can you please stop using my pool without checking with me first?" Mark's smile faded slightly. "Jake, we really didn't mean to overstep. We thought you were okay with it." Jake took a deep breath. "I know you didn't mean anything by it, but it's been happening so often now. I need my space, my privacy. It's starting to feel like it's not just my pool anymore. I need you to understand where I'm coming from." Rachel, who had been quiet until now, looked at Jake with a soft expression. "We didn't realize it was bothering you this much," she said gently. "We're sorry if we've been inconsiderate. We'll be more careful in the future, we promise." Jake nodded, his shoulders relaxing a little. "Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate that. It's just hard when it feels like no one is respecting my boundaries." The conversation wasn't over, but Jake could see they were genuinely trying to understand his point of view. It wasn't easy for him to speak up, but now that he had, he felt a little lighter. He wasn't asking for much, just a simple acknowledgement that his space mattered. Jake wasn't sure if everything would change right away, but he hoped this was the first step toward getting things back to the way they should be. As Mark and Rachel returned to their poolside chairs, Jake stood there for a moment, watching the kids splashing around. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a while, he felt a sense of peace. He had spoken his mind, and now he just had to wait and see if things would change. Jake spent the next few days trying to shake off the tension that had lingered after his conversation with Mark and Rachel. They had promised to respect his space, but deep down, Jake wasn't sure if it would stick. He kept thinking about their responses and wondering if they truly understood the impact their visits had on him. It was a strange feeling to question his neighbors, people he had lived next to for years, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how important it was to set boundaries, not just for the pool, but for his own peace of mind. That weekend, Jake took matters into his own hands. He didn't want to wait around to see if they'd show up again. He needed to act fast, to make it clear that this wasn't just a minor request, but something that mattered deeply to him. The backyard had once been his sanctuary, a place to unwind, and he wasn't about to let that slip away. Jake spent the morning walking around his yard, looking at the pool from different angles, trying to figure out how to make a change. He knew he needed something that would be both practical and effective, but he didn't want to do anything too drastic. After all, he didn't want to create more tension with his neighbors. But as he paced around, the solution began to form in his mind. Later that afternoon, Jake made a few calls. He contacted a local contractor and arranged for a fence to be built around the pool. It wouldn't be anything too high or imposing, but just enough to create a clear boundary. He also decided to install a gate that he could lock when he didn't want anyone coming in. It wasn't that he didn't like Mark and Rachel. It was simply about protecting his space, a space that had become too vulnerable for his liking. As he looked over the plans with the contractor, Jake felt a sense of relief. This was the change he needed. It wouldn't be an immediate fix, but it was a step in the right direction. He wasn't the type of person to take matters into his own hands aggressively, but after weeks of feeling like his pool had become a public space, Jake realized that sometimes you have to be proactive to preserve your peace. The next day, construction began. The sound of tools and machinery filled the air as the contractor and his team worked quickly to put up the fence. Jake watched them from his window, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. The fence was coming together, and he could already picture how the backyard would look once it was finished. It would be a clear line, marking what was his and what was not. But as the fence started to take shape, Jake couldn't help but wonder what Mark and Rachel would think. Would they be upset? Would they feel like he was being too extreme? He had tried to be patient and understanding, but he also knew that sometimes boundaries had to be made physical. He hoped they would understand, but part of him knew they might not. As the work continued, Jake tried to push his worries aside. He reminded himself that he was doing what he needed to do for his own mental and emotional well-being. When the fence was completed, Jake stood at the edge of his yard and looked out at the pool. It felt different now, more secure. He had taken control of his space, and though he wasn't sure how things would go with his neighbors, Jake knew one thing for certain. He had done what he needed to protect his peace. The day the fence was completed, Jake stood in his backyard, staring at the work that had just been finished. The new fence, though not overly tall, created a definite line between his space and the world outside. It was sturdy, simple, and exactly what he needed to feel like his privacy was restored. The pool, once an open invitation for anyone to come in and use, was now clearly separated from the outside world. He had a gate installed as well, one that he could lock whenever he felt the need for peace and quiet. Jake admired the work for a moment, taking in the clean lines and the way it blended seamlessly with the rest of his yard. It didn't feel overbearing or harsh, but it made a clear statement. His space was his own. There was a sense of satisfaction in the accomplishment, but also a little bit of unease. The fence wasn't just a physical boundary. It was also a declaration, one that might change things with his neighbors. He knew the time had come to face them again. As the weekend rolled around, Jake could already hear the sounds of laughter coming from next door. He could see the familiar figures of Mark and Rachel, this time with a few more friends, walking towards his backyard, as they had done so many times before. His stomach turned slightly. He wasn't sure how they would react to the new addition, but he had already made up his mind. This was his last attempt at creating the peaceful environment he longed for. As they approached the fence, Jake stepped outside, his heart racing a little. Mark and Rachel greeted him warmly, but there was a noticeable pause when they saw the new structure. The kids, oblivious to the change, continued playing in the yard, but Jake could see the confusion in their eyes. Mark was the first to speak up, his voice a little cautious. "Jake, we didn't know you were making changes. What's with the fence?" Jake took a deep breath and tried to keep his voice steady. "I thought it was time to make things clearer. I've been feeling a bit crowded lately, and I really needed my space. I'm sure you understand." Mark and Rachel exchanged a glance. The smile they had when they first approached slowly faded. Jake could tell they were processing the situation, trying to figure out how to respond. Rachel spoke softly. "Jake, we didn't realize how much this was affecting you. We're sorry if we've crossed any lines. We thought we were just being friendly, but if this is how you feel, we understand." Jake nodded, feeling a little more at ease. "I didn't want to make it awkward, but it was becoming a lot to deal with. It's not that I don't like you or your family. It's just about having some time to myself in my own space." There was a long silence, and for a moment, Jake wasn't sure what their response would be. He had taken the step of building the fence, but he wasn't sure if it was too much, too soon. Mark, however, broke the silence with a small chuckle. "I get it now, Jake. I guess we got a little carried away. We didn't mean to make you feel like your pool wasn't yours anymore." Rachel gave him a reassuring smile. "We'll respect your space, Jake. You don't have to worry about us anymore. Thanks for being honest with us." Jake felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't easy having that conversation, but it was exactly what needed to happen. His neighbors weren't angry. In fact, they seemed to understand where he was coming from. The awkwardness that had filled the air earlier had started to lift. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. As they said their goodbyes and walked back to their house, Jake stood there, watching them leave. The fence, while a physical barrier, had also brought about an emotional shift. It wasn't just about keeping his neighbors out. It was about taking control of his life again. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt at peace. He had taken action, and it had worked. The quiet, relaxing days by the pool that he had once taken for granted were now within reach again. After the conversation with Mark and Rachel, Jake felt a sense of relief he hadn't realized he was missing. The fence, while still a bit of a strange sight to him, was already starting to feel like a solid decision. He had taken control of his space, and while it had been an awkward conversation at first, it seemed to have done the trick. For the next few days, things returned to normal. Well, as normal as things could be when you had neighbors who had grown so accustomed to spending time in your yard. The fence was still new, and Jake couldn't help but notice how it stood as a clear reminder of the boundaries he had set. But even with the peace of mind he now had, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. He had hoped that Mark and Rachel would respect the changes, but part of him feared that, over time, they would start pushing the boundaries again. It wasn't that they were bad people, but habits were hard to break, and Jake knew that people sometimes took the path of least resistance, especially when they were used to something. A week later, as Jake sat in his living room, the familiar sounds of children playing in the yard next door began again. He glanced out the window, expecting to see the usual activity, but what he saw instead was a group of friends, Mark, Rachel, and a few others, standing near the pool. They were talking, laughing, and gesturing toward the water, but none of them seemed to notice the fence. Jake felt a twinge of frustration. This wasn't what he had intended when he built the fence. It wasn't just about a physical barrier. It was about his need for space and respect. Watching them, Jake wondered if they had already forgotten his request, or if they simply hadn't taken him seriously enough. It stung. This wasn't just a matter of them crossing a line. It was a violation of the trust he had given them by allowing them into his space for so long. He had been kind, he had been generous, but now, they were ignoring the very boundaries he had set. With his heart pounding in his chest, Jake decided that he wasn't going to sit quietly this time. He had done everything right before, spoken directly to them, explained his feelings, but it hadn't worked. Now, he needed to take action. He walked toward the back door again, his mind racing with thoughts of how this conversation might go. Was he being too harsh? Would they understand? Or would they think he was overreacting? As Jake approached the fence, he saw Mark and Rachel. They were deep in conversation, unaware that he had come outside. His presence caught their attention, and they paused. Mark was the first to speak, and his face betrayed a hint of surprise. "Jake, we were just talking about you." Jake's voice was calm but firm. "I thought we agreed that we wouldn't just show up here anymore. I've asked for my privacy, and I need you to respect that." His words were measured, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his tone. Rachel, who had been quiet up until that point, looked taken aback. "Jake, we didn't realize that this was still bothering you. We just came over to talk and see if you were okay." "Talking is fine," Jake replied, "but this is my space. And if you want to talk, you can do that without crossing the line. We've been over this." There was a long pause. Mark and Rachel exchanged a glance, and Jake could see the realization starting to set in. This wasn't about small inconveniences anymore. It was about respect. The respect that Jake had been asking for all along. "I'm sorry, Jake," Mark finally said, his voice apologetic. "We should have respected the space you've created. It wasn't our intention to make you feel uncomfortable." Rachel nodded, looking genuinely regretful. "We understand now, and we'll be more careful. We'll make sure we don't intrude anymore." Jake didn't know if things would be perfect from here on out, but he felt a sense of hope that this time, they really did get it. As they walked back to their house, Jake stood there for a moment, watching them go. His heart, which had been tense all week, finally began to relax. The situation wasn't easy, but it had been necessary. Now, Jake felt confident that his boundaries would be respected. The quiet space he had fought for was finally his again. The days that followed felt different, quieter. Jake hadn't realized just how much the constant interruptions had affected him until they stopped. There was a sense of calm that settled over him as he spent his time by the pool, enjoying the privacy that he had so desperately needed. For the first time in weeks, he could fully relax in his backyard without the nagging feeling of being watched or intruded upon. The sound of the breeze rustling through the trees, the soft ripple of the water in the pool, It all felt like a return to the sanctuary he had once taken for granted. Yet, despite the relief, there was something lingering in Jake's mind. He had set a clear boundary with his neighbors, but as the days passed, he couldn't help but wonder if it had been the right move. Had he been too harsh? Was there a better way to handle the situation without creating such tension? The more Jake thought about it, the more he realized just how difficult it had been for him to speak up. He wasn't someone who liked confrontation, and the last thing he wanted was to hurt his relationship with Mark and Rachel. It wasn't that Jake was regretting his decision, but he was questioning whether he had gone about it the best way. What if there had been a better way to express his need for space without putting up the fence and causing awkwardness? What if they had just needed a little more time to adjust to the change? The doubts crept in slowly, but Jake tried to push them aside. The fence was up, and the boundaries had been set. It was what he had needed to do for his own peace of mind. Still, a part of him couldn't shake the thought that maybe things could have gone differently. One afternoon, as Jake sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, he noticed Mark and Rachel walking by. They were heading to their car, their conversation light and friendly. For a moment, Jake wondered if this was his chance to reach out, to make sure they knew there were no hard feelings. He didn't want things to stay awkward between them. And he knew that sometimes the best way to move forward was to acknowledge the past and clear the air. Without thinking too much, Jake stood up and walked over to the gate, calling out to Mark and Rachel. They turned, and when they saw him, they stopped in their tracks. For a second, Jake felt the familiar nervousness in his chest, but he quickly shook it off. He wasn't confronting them. He was simply making sure they knew he appreciated their understanding. "Hey, Mark, Rachel," Jake said, his voice a little more casual than it had been the last time they spoke. "I just wanted to check in and make sure there's no hard feelings. I know the fence was a big change, and I hope it didn't come off too harshly." Mark smiled, the tension in his expression fading. "Jake, honestly, we get it. We've been thinking about it, and we understand why you did what you did. It wasn't a problem for us. We just needed to adjust." Rachel nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it was a bit unexpected, but now we see that you just needed your space. We respect that." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had been nervous that his actions might have created lasting tension, but now, hearing their words, he felt like they were on the same page. There was no ill will between them. The situation had been resolved, not just with the fence, but with open communication. "I really appreciate that," Jake said, offering the sincere smile. "I just wanted to make sure we're all good. I don't want things to stay awkward between us." Mark and Rachel both smiled back. "We're good, Jake," Mark assured him. "No hard feelings at all." As they walked away, Jake stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. The breeze, the peaceful backyard, the quiet that had returned. It all felt like a weight had been lifted. He had learned something important through this whole experience. Sometimes setting boundaries was hard, but it was necessary. And when you communicated openly, things didn't have to stay tense. In the end, Jake had not only protected his space, but also preserved the friendship with his neighbors. The quiet days by the pool felt even more precious now, not just because they were uninterrupted, but because Jake had taken the steps to make them his own again. As the weeks went by, the changes in Jake's life began to settle in. His backyard, once a place of tension and uncertainty, had become a peaceful retreat once more. The fence had worked its magic, not just as a physical barrier, but as a symbol of the space he had claimed for himself. There were no more unexpected guests, no more awkward moments where he'd have to decide whether to confront his neighbors again. Things had returned to a new kind of normal, one that felt right for Jake. He found himself spending more time in the yard, enjoying the solitude that had once been interrupted by the laughter and chatter of his neighbors. The pool was his again, and he used it in ways he hadn't before. Mornings were spent with a cup of coffee in hand, sitting by the edge of the pool, watching the sun rise and spread its warmth over his little slice of paradise. Sometimes he would take a book outside and lose himself in its pages, the quiet of the morning wrapping around him like a blanket. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that kind of peace, the kind that didn't require sharing or explaining. Yet, every now and then, Jake couldn't help but wonder if he'd made the right decision. He had set his boundaries, and they were respected, but he still fought back to that moment when he put up the fence. Was it too much? Had he overreacted? It wasn't that he regretted the choice. It was just that sometimes the echoes of those doubts crept back into his mind. But when he looked around his yard, saw the fence standing quietly in place, and felt the calm settle over him, Jake knew that he had done what was necessary for his own well-being. One afternoon, as Jake sat in the sun, he saw Mark and Rachel walking toward him. This time, there was no hesitation. They weren't there to ask for anything or to explain their actions. They were simply stopping by to check in. Jake stood up, feeling a sense of comfort in their presence now, knowing that they had respected his boundaries and he had respected theirs. "Hey, Jake," Mark greeted him with a friendly smile. "We just wanted to say thank you for the way you handled everything. We've really been thinking about it, and we understand now." Jake returned the smile, feeling relieved. "No problem, Mark. I appreciate how understanding you both have been. It wasn't easy, but I think it worked out." Rachel nodded. "We were just talking the other day about how things feel a lot more balanced now. We're glad we could respect your space, and honestly, we've been a lot more mindful of other people's boundaries since." Jake felt a warmth spread through him. It was nice to hear that they understood, and even nicer to know that his actions had prompted them to reflect on their own behavior. He had never wanted to create a rift, but at the same time, he had needed to make sure his needs were respected. "Well, I appreciate that," Jake said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I think this has been good for both of us. It's nice to know we're all on the same page now." As they chatted for a few more minutes, Jake realized just how much the situation had changed. What had once felt like an uncomfortable confrontation had turned into an opportunity for growth. Not only had he found a way to protect his space, but he had also strengthened his relationship with his neighbors. It was a reminder that sometimes uncomfortable moments could lead to positive change, as long as both sides were willing to listen and learn. When they said their goodbyes and walked back to their house, Jake watched them go with a contented sigh. The fence, which had once seemed like an imposition, had become a symbol of the respect and understanding that had grown between them. It wasn't just a structure in the yard. It was a reminder of what could be achieved when boundaries were communicated clearly and when people cared enough to honor each other's needs. Jake turned back to his pool, the soft sound of the water lapping at the edges calming him once again. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over everything. It was peaceful here, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt truly at home.